Hello, I'm Jonathan Gardner, an archaeologist and Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the School of Art, Edinburgh College of Art. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about two research projects I've been doing. One I began back in 2012, and the other I just started last month here in Edinburgh. So I'm interested in how the layering of the past, the collapsing of times together continues to influence us in the present, and a particular work that's been helpful for this is Gillian Tyndall's phenomenal book, The Fields Beneath. And this is about the history of the North London suburb of Kentish Town and how it kind of became part of London over 2,000 years. Though written in 1977, this book is striking in its insistence on how the past literally and figuratively shapes the streets we walk on today, and suggests that by peeling back the layers literally and figuratively, we can demonstrate radical and hidden histories that remain here beneath the surface. So the histories that I am interested in concern industrial wastelands, both what they are made of materially and how they are conceptualized. And this is about language, about specific discourses that underpin urban change. So wasteland is normally a negative thing, something to mean kind of a socially deprived or semi-derelict area, and these are kind of practices which, though we're using terms like this, actually underpin the urban change I'm going to speak about. So calling something wasteland is powerful. There's obviously many other words related to this, all subject to multiple definitions, and I won't go into them all here, but often things like brownfield in the UK, simply to mean previously industrial land. And often these words connote a negativity, but in urban development, they also indicate opportunity and the potential for investment and profit, a development opportunity perhaps. So as many have kind of theorized, concepts of waste, dirt or rubble, such substances are often kind of subjectively interpreted. They're not as self-evident as we might guess. As Mary Douglas famously said, dirt is matter out of place, but clearly it depends on whose place and what matter, and indeed when, and this can change obviously through time. Elaine Freychot more recently has suggested that the ambiguity of waste substances and waste landscapes and as dirt can be powerful in, say, sparking off creativity or rethinking how we use cities and architecture. I also want to talk about ruins and rubble briefly. I actually disagree with Puff here, who says that, rubble is without significance. If we go to someone like Gaston Gordillo, he suggests that the conceptual categorization of rubble opens up new opportunities for keeping different temporalities and spatialities in mind, and that rubble as a substance is a subjective category. And I suggest this can apply to waste and wastelands more broadly. And this intermingling of the material and the discursive of waste and wastelands is something that underpins all the places I'm going to talk about in a second. It's sometimes the only trace of these places' previous existence too. So this relates to my earlier research, as I say, on mega events in London, places like the Great Exhibition and the Festival of Britain. But today I'm going to focus on the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games site in East London in Stratford, on the top there. So this is the stadium, and this is the map of the site as it's kind of projected to be in legacy today. And this was originally an area of industry, of marshes, of rivers, and of infrastructure, including highways, major sewers, railways, canals, and power pylons. And I was involved in this project as far back as 2007 as a fresh-faced archaeologist who worked here along with many others, excavating sites before the venues were built to prepare for the games. And at the time, and in the run-up to the games, this place was called an industrial wasteland. It was seen as derelict, underutilized, or indeed a scar across the East End, and these are all direct quotes. And this was despite it being home to around 600 different businesses, 5,000 jobs, several hundred residents. All of them had to leave under a compulsory purchase order or eminent domain back in 2007. And you can see we were excavating this boat on the site of the main stadium here where it says Trench 2. This was also the site of Parks Galvanizing, a successful business which had to move out and eventually relocated to Essex. So as we dug in the backyard of Parks or other places, I began to think about my own role as part of this transformation, and it slightly troubled me. I kind of began to ask, well, was this place really so wasted? And if so, what had made it so? Are the processes of changing it for the games actually wasting it further? What makes a wasteland? And obviously, it's undeniable that this place was polluted, and this was an effect of its past kind of industrial history, often very successfully. But it was also a result of kind of deindustrialization in the UK and in London, particularly from the 1960s with the closure of the city's docks in the south, to the south of the site, knocking on effects to the industries here. And by the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a kind of firm belief that this place was a wasteland by politicians and others, despite the existing businesses and indeed several hundred residents who still lived here. And really, this was one of the justifications for choosing this site for the games, that this was a wasteland. It needed to be cleaned up. It needed to be transformed. The other word that we found used a lot here, particularly in the archaeological works, was this made ground. So the Olympic site is on the River Lee, and its channels here are kind of prone to flooding. This is the largest tributary of the Thames and has for millennia been quite a marshy area. So since the Roman period, some 2,000 years ago, efforts have been made to reclaim land here. And by the industrial period, this was achieved by dumping vast quantities of rubbish, construction waste, and in the Second World War, bomb rubble. So literally making land, making ground from the marshes. And in this sense, a kind of positive sense of waste. It's actually a useful substance here. It provided space for industry and then for the games themselves. This, for example, is the main stadium again. And if we click away, it's also the site of an historic landfill site. This is from 1934. So before, this was quite a low-lying area, and this landfill site created a hill, which was then reshaped for the stadium. So there's two elements to this. The material, the dumping of trash or rubbish and bomb rubble to make land, that's what made this place useful and actually facilitated development. But it also made it vulnerable to the planner's eye. And I think coming together with the discursive idea of the wasteland, the stories that were told about this made it vulnerable for radical change. And though not totally wiped off the map, it was transformed. So fragments of the old Stratford still exist. It's repurposed as rubble in bridge embankments, or these hills are actually the re-landscaped and cleaned up soil and dirt and waste themselves. So where were all the archaeologists in this? What were we doing? There I am. This is one of the largest excavations under the velodrome back in 2008. But we were paid only to investigate paths that were considered valuable. The wasteland, the recent history of industrialization, was not considered part of the archaeology. And this site itself was 10 meters beneath a historic landfill site. A few other finds there. This is the kind of thing we were interested in. So for the developers, the politicians, and indeed the archaeologists, the ancient past was what we favoured. Really things several hundred years or 1,000 years old. And it made for better newspaper copy and PR, rather than talking about those that had to leave through forced purchase or other things of that nature. So the kind of past that we ignored was connected to the people still living here, the people still working here. So this is a poster for a new housing development on the Park of Today, a legacy development of the games, Chobham Manor, and no doubt is a vibrant community. But actually this replaces one that was already there, which was unfortunately deemed part of the wasteland. So this is Clays Lane, a housing cooperative which was built in the 1970s and was here until the compulsory purchase in 2007 and housed several hundred people on low incomes. It had to go so the Olympics could be built. So this too was part of the wasteland, at least in a discursive sense, and no doubt some of its fragments are used in those embankments and landscaping we saw earlier. As an archaeologist, this raises a lot of ethical questions about what we could and could not do, and it's not something I'm going to go into today, but just to flag up that we too played a role in creating this wasteland, I think. I want to end now with my new project and quite a different example of how such waste landscapes are made and conceptualized. And crucially, the idea that waste and wastelands can be valued and useful, but more often are just kind of ignored. So I've been looking at this beach near where I live in Edinburgh, in Granton. So there's Edinburgh, and this is the area of the city I'm talking about right on the north. And this is less a kind of site of dissonance and more one that's just simply disregarded in grand plans for future development. And I should say nobody lives there, and there are very few kind of businesses left. But nonetheless, it's a useful place to rethink what the waste allowed for the city in the past and how it will affect its future. So this is a closer view next to a former industrial harbour in this orange area in this beach called General's Rock Beach. So like a lot of the area in this part of town, it's reclaimed from the sea, mainly using brick and concrete rubble, but it is gradually eroding out due to rising sea levels. You can actually, what might look to you like sand, all of this is actually brick rubble and concrete rubble. So that is making up that, and indeed the green area behind is all made of that material as well. So I've been trying to get to the bottom of when this part of the area was reclaimed. That's another view of it there. We can do historic map analysis, so we can see in the 1960s the industrial nature of the area and this refuse tip gradually growing onto the beach to its current extent. So I'm trying to find out about why the city did this. You know, why were they reclaiming this little bit of land, and how is it envisaged in new plans for the area which have emerged recently? So there's the beach itself, looking back towards a former gas holder, and you can see all the fragments of rubble there. The bricks themselves, we can actually identify where they've come from by their maker's marks, although we don't know where the buildings they were demolished from were, and that's something that's very difficult to find out, but I will try. And the bricks are just gradually destroying one another by rubbing against each other as the sea levels rise and the storms get bigger. I'm also interested in the kind of cultural history of this place. The reason it's called General's Rock is because Henry VIII's general, the Earl of Hertford, invaded Edinburgh in 1544 and then burnt down the city while he tried to get Mary Queen of Scots to marry Henry's son. This is all but forgotten now that this beach was supposedly this landing point. More recently, people have started to kind of adopt this beach and do interesting things creatively. They're starting to make artwork out of the rubble. They have barbecues. There's all kinds of things going on here, particularly during lockdown. So I'm going to try and investigate some of those too. So that's it from further back. So you can see all this kind of green area. This is actually brownfield, most of it. It's former industrial land. And this is being eyed up for development. Unlike the Olympics, as I say, there's few businesses or housing on these sites, but there are kind of grand plans to build new parks and new housing, very much as part of the city's sustainable development story and plans. So it's not clear what will happen to the beach itself. Not yet, anyway. As part of the wider project, I'm going to investigate how waste landscapes are created physically, materially, and that's kind of discursive wastelands too. So a few sites around Scotland there, but also across the UK. So to kind of conclude, I think we need to pay attention as archaeologists to both the material and the discursive creation of wastelands. All too often, the substance is taken for granted, with little interest in how this categorization is made or changed. The industrial history of these sites, for example, produced this material. And invoking wasteland can lead to kind of development, but it can also perhaps create other outcomes as well. This material is capable of telling other stories, hidden stories too, and I think archaeologists should be part of that rather than simply facilitating its removal in favour of more ancient past. Thanks very much.